One of the gentlemen who was attending the sale as the Chief Executive Officer of Racing South Africa wasn't just there for a little bit of fun to see exactly whose ego was the largest and who spent the most money on the horse. Bottom line is Peter Gibson was there to support a delegation of Hong Kong businessmen and passionate horse racing fans to replenish the stocks which they have the opportunity to buy all over the world. Pete, a very warm welcome to the lifeblood of racing. I know that you're a dyed-in-the-wool horseman. You love the game.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the rands and cents of turnover, which is obviously very important to the survival of the game. But nice to have the Hong Kong chaps out here. I know you spent a lot of time there working on the East. How was it for them? How was it for you?
Now look, it's one of our functions. It's the South African Equine Trade Council is one of the divisions of Racing South Africa. It's our marketing division, international focus. And we're there to really introduce South African bloodstock, in fact, of all breeds, to the international market. And one of our annual initiatives is to bring a delegation from Hong Kong to the Ready to Run. And we had a delegation of 6. 2 horses were bought. I think they found it quite strong. Not surprising given the fact that the average was up, but it was a fantastic experience for them. They bought a very nice Cahal colt, and they bought a very nice Solskjaer colt. Both will go through Mauritius and early in the new year, but they were very pleased. New faces for South Africa, and given the fact that South Africa has only 2 South African bred horses in Hong Kong of a population of 1,000 at the moment, it's a desperate scenario. So any number of horses that we can get there is a boost for our bloodstock, and I wish them well and thank them for coming to South Africa.
Well, in a way, it's absolutely ludicrous because we've discussed this before. But you can never make enough of it. When I spoke to Mike de Kock, he said to me that we have gone backwards since 1997. There are good reasons for that, but never before have Racing South Africa been involved in a more significant and more definitive thrust than they are presently involved in.
Yeah, look, that's very true. I mean, it's very evident that we have gone backwards. But in going backwards, we've actually made a huge amount of progress in some of our major strategic initiatives. Firstly, the rule changes through the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, some fundamental changes to the way in which countries infected with African horse sickness can export their horses were adopted at the General Assembly in May this year. We can go into some detail later on if you'd like to.
Yep.
The second thing is that the diagnostic testing capability. The old ELISA system was based on a serology picture. Take a sample day 1, another one day 21. You're looking for stability or a decline. It was cumbersome, it was long-winded, and there were question marks about its sensitivity. So Alan Guthrie's team at the Equine Research Centre for the last 4 or 5 years has been developing a real-time PCR where they look at evidence of virus at a DNA level. That test is now completed. Outstanding results. It's currently under scientific review before it will be published in a reputable scientific journal.
Yeah.
And that will then kickstart the next phase of validation. And I think that those 2 were the cornerstones of our ambitions or our strategy. Both have been concluded. Now really it's up to international trading partners to introduce the legislation, seriously look at the science, and hopefully allow us to actually become much more reliable in terms of our delivery. The truth of the matter from a practical perspective is that we happen, unfortunately, to be in the middle of a 2-year suspension based on last year's outbreak.
Yep.
It looks as though with all our engagement with our foreign trading partners that they're all wanting to align themselves with the European Union, whose current legislation does not allow an earlier lifting of the suspension before the 24-month period is up. And that comes in May of 2013.
But it's still archaic. We have to be honest with that. John McVeigh, when I spoke to him at Royal Ascot, he says the science is sound. It's irrefutable.
Yes.
So it's got to be politics. Without
Look,
trying to stir an unnecessary pot, it has got to be politics.
Look, there's clearly a trade element. I mean, we're all in the business of making money. I spoke about South Africa's market share in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
It's slightly better in Singapore.
But we've got one very good horse in Hong Kong at the moment.
We've got 2 very good horses in Hong Kong. Atto,
Atto
and of course
Cerise
Flax.
Cherry.
Oh, Hong Kong. Sorry, I got my markets mixed up. You're absolutely right. So Cerise Cherry put up an incredible performance. And from what I hear from the connections, that they took a decision to geld this horse at the age of 6, and this seems to have been the undoing of his last season's demise, where his rating dropped by 15 pounds. He's back up to 114, and I looked at his time, which was pretty much the same as JJ's when he won 2 years ago. So if he continues in this vein of form, I tell you what, we've got another serious contender in that sprint race.
And he was always the perennial bridesmaid. He ran second. I think he ran second in the Dingons, and also very, very versatile. If my memory serves me correctly, a son of goalkeeper.
Yeah, goalkeeper has been an absolute legend in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I mean, this
Well,
is
he
a
is
tough
so
horse.
well bred.
He's beautifully bred. I mean, they seem to go on those conditions. Tiger King Prawn, I think, was another that won 5 or 6 on the trot for Tony Millard before he unfortunately he injured himself. He still holds the track record at Happy Valley. He's now currently standing in New Zealand, can you believe it? Robert Chung, who's one of Roy Magna's clients, has got a number of mares there, so he's standing, and maybe one day one of his sons will come back here. But goalkeeper has been an outstanding success. It's been a pity about his fertility. We saw a very good looking son of his beat the Hangman on Saturday. I forget his name, Frederick something along those lines, but I'm sure that
the Dingons.
Yep,
I beg your pardon, the Graham Beck.
And the Graham Beck, that's correct. And I'm sure that the owner of Cerise Cherry will be looking closely at whether this fellow qualifies one day.
Well, Pete, let's break down this new thrust into clearly definitive packages, because anybody channel hopping will think to themselves, we're talking about the horse. To get the South African horse onto the world stage has been your thrust, but there seems to be new life, and let's hear about it.
Okay, look, I think I'd like to take a much longer term view. And if we look at the Olympic Games, and South Africa's already made noises in the past that we would host it one day, of which there is an equestrian component. That would require the management of 400 horses coming into the country and departure within a month of having competed. So I think if all of the sporting bodies within the equestrian community need to think about that. I've got a meeting with SASCOC tomorrow to really try and stimulate some discussion as to how we can move towards that. Because really what we're doing right now with an export focus are ultimately the building blocks for the way in which we can introduce international competition to South Africa. Clearly the Olympics will be the longer term goal. Yeah. And I know that there's a new South African Equestrian Federation body that's been formed. It's now the new official body. They are dealing with these things on an international. And really what we're trying to do is gather all of the community, the equestrian communities, under one single strategy to work toward, let's say, the Olympic Games. But going back to that, exports has been the driver. The OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, really defines the way in which countries can then write protocols. And they've basically now are taking a much greater role in international trade. Based on recommendations from the OIE, we've now got a very clear 4-point strategy. One is to complete a dossier, which allows us to apply for OIE freedom. So in other words, the OIE declares freedom of African horse sickness or any other disease rather than individual countries. Secondly, we've got to prove that we can manage the movement of horses and therefore the potential of virus to come into our controlled area. And there are a number of projects that we've been going. Thanks to the funding from the Thoroughbred Racing Trust, we've currently undertaking a census of all horses in the controlled area. That's free and surveillance, not the protection zone. Okay. That's pretty much most of the way
Just define those zones for the people that are not sure of them.
There are 3 zones under the current system. The free is very small, which is effectively the Cape Town CBD, where Kenilworth quarantine station is.
Right. So Durbanville doesn't fall inside that at all.
Now, 50 k's outside of Cape Town, and a radius from the west coast to the east coast is the surveillance zone.
Yep.
There's certain conditions that horses resident in that area have to meet.
Okay.
Now you take another 100 kilometers from the border of the surveillance zone out towards, let's say, the north.
Yes.
Same radius, there would be, that's called the protection zone.
Okay.
Now horses, in other words, I mean, as an example, horses are obliged to be vaccinated in that zone. And that takes us on to another program, protecting our zone. The African Horse Sickness Trust is undertaking, again with funding from the Thoroughbred Racing Trust, a vaccination campaign of all the indigent community horses. That is going to really plug in vaccine, try and boost the immunity of that local herd. And
cart
again,
horses and that sort of stuff.
The whole range, as long as they're indigent. The trust is there to assist the poorer communities. It's something that in an ideal world the state veterinary services would be managing, but we are supporting them.
Yeah.
It's part of the controlled area, therefore there's very strong controls about that.
Policing?
And then policing. Now, we've had a very, very helpful meeting with the Department of Transport in the Western Cape, and they have come on board really in a strong way to assist us in terms of roadblocks throughout the high-risk season, and more importantly, in my opinion, is mobile units being able to pull off horse trucks, checking for documentation. And if there is a problem, that there's a response team that can come out and make sure that those horses, firstly, are well cared for,
Yep.
but are turned outside of our zone. And from a trading perspective, I'm only concerned about the introduction of virus to the control area, because that obviously leads to an outbreak and therefore a suspension,
Compromises the integrity
which has
of the-
massive economic consequences on South Africa, the industry, and of course a company like Racing South Africa, which is generating revenue to put back into industry. We're a non-profit organisation. So that's protecting the zone. The third thing is what happens in the event of an outbreak. And to me, that's where the current rules, where you've been suspended for 2 years, has been our number one Achilles heel. It's unscientific. It's crippling in terms of our economics and our market drive, international trading initiatives. And so really this is now a budget and a mechanism that allows us to respond very quickly to an outbreak, ideally to contain it, and therefore within a certain time frame which is accepted by the OIE, to prove that it has not gone outside of that containment zone, hasn't crossed a border, and therefore we can apply for reinstatement of our exports, let's call it 80 days after the last case, which in a practical sense, we're most likely to have an outbreak between February and April.
But with the early rains this year?
Well, don't forget Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, the traditional areas where we get early cases. That's fine. I mean,
because it doesn't affect the free zone.
It doesn't affect. What it does pose, of course, is the movement of horses from these areas into the controlled area poses that risk. So, we can never say that an outbreak is not likely to happen again. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do is limit the
punitive action.
It's certainly that, but also to limit the likelihood of it happening.
Yeah.
And if we do have it, worst case scenario, that we can have the mechanisms to contain it, to apply for our freedom again, and let's call it that we would be able therefore to export within our winter timeframes, which is what some people have been going on for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And maybe in hindsight, if you'd been able to introduce that sort of window early on, it might have allowed us more continuity. But I mean, it's impossible to go back and say that the system was wrong at the time of implementing in 1997. We took what we could. Now we're refining it.
Well, the Kulukoris doesn't survive in those harsh conditions.
Yes, so the breeding habits of the Kulukoris, whether it's in a frost environment or a heavy rainfall, cold, consistent cold conditions in the Western Cape, it simply stops the breeding habits of the virus, of the Kulukoris, and therefore the transmission of the virus.
Okay.
So that's the third thing.
Yeah.
And the fourth thing really is to actually support veterinary services. Ultimately, trading takes place between governments. And South Africa has an obligation to prove that its credibility to its trading partners. And we know in this environment where, not only the horse business, but red meat exports, ostrich exports have been impacted, partly by some of the systems that have not been managed as well as they could be. And I think the truth of the matter is that industry is going to have to partner government, and I think there's a willingness on both sides to do so. So we are providing mechanisms to assist government in providing and making up for some of those shortfalls. And I'd like to just sort of point out two appointments that Racing South Africa, through its shareholding, has made. One is a liaison officer that was previously funded by the South African Equine Trade Council. Dr. Beverly Zietsman really is there to bridge the gap between industry and government. She's formerly an ex-state vet, so she has a wealth of knowledge, and performs that sort of that bridging of what we require as industry.
How does Dr. Parker feel about her having kept her maiden name?
Well, given the fact that his primary source of income is thoroughbred exports, I would say that he's
He
got
doesn't
very
care.
little choice. No, he whinges from time to time. But Bev's a hard-working lady, and we're very pleased to have on the team.
Yep.
She's been with us, as I said, on a much smaller scale for the last 4 or 5 years. So, and we're very grateful to the DTI for having funded that position up until now. And then the second appointment, which to me is a crucial one, is call it the AHS Control Manager. Dr. Camilla Vey is currently a PhD student with Alan at the Equine Research Centre.
Professor Guthrie.
Professor Guthrie, but she's going to have completed that, and we've already defined a role for her where she will manage most of the functions pertaining to the way in which we ultimately export. So call it managing the surveillance system, topping up the census when that's required, looking at movement controls. We're developing an electronic system.
As they do with the ostriches.
As they do with the ostriches. And in other words, coordinating all of those effectively state veterinary functions, but under private sector funding. So we're very pleased to have both of those capable ladies on the team. And, you know, as I said, we are surrounded by a real team of experts, consultant veterinarians from Germany. Dr. Josef Berning has played a role. Benny van der Merwe is now sitting on the Racing South Africa board and also serves on the Equine Research Centre Management Committee. Danielle Pienaar is coordinating the census program. She's previously in the Western Cape sport horse community. So really, I think we've got a real platform now to get through the next phase. And really that is to get to May next year without a subsequent outbreak, to then re-engage with our trading partners with whom we have got a long-standing history of good relationships.
And credibility.
And there is demand for our product. I think the Hong Kong guys that came this weekend were flabbergasted at the prices and the quality of the horses that they've seen. Not forgetting the sport horse community, which always put in the endurance and the polo and the Olympic horses. So I'm very excited about the fact what we as a country really need to do. And that means through government and the equestrian communities, love to have SASCOC really closely involved. Ultimately, they will be the body that arranges the Olympic Games, and industry, that we unite behind a strategy and that we all focus towards this goal. And it's achievable, I have no doubt, and it's very good business for the country to have a thriving equestrian business. We know the value of the employment in the rural community. We know the value of foreign revenue coming into South Africa, and it's going to grow exponentially once systems come on board. So, look, I'm an optimist. I love horse racing, but my functions are the export sort of scenarios. But it will ultimately lead to things that I am, you know, passionate and driven by, such as an international horse race one day.
To put the lid on it, after having watched some of the people that bought horses, the Fastnet Rocks, the Henry the Navigators, Taylor the Cat was a top priced horse for 2 million rand. The rap is yours, Pete.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you for having me on the show. It's nice to be able to get what we're doing out into the open. Look, the sale itself was great theatre, watching a new buyer coming in with a buyer's card for 100 grand and spending 1.5 million. I think that's the story that's going around, whether it's true or not. Hair-raising stuff.
Yeah.
But it was real theatre, and I think that really it all focuses around this wonderful product, which is the horse. Everything is really drives from that perspective. We all love horses and the sport of racing, and the sales environment is real fun, and it gives people who are in big business an opportunity to express some of their enjoyment in a different way. So, you know, I think things are moving in the right direction.